So this is the conclusion to the pet casket build. Even though this was made for a dog, obviously you can put any sort of pet you have in a box like this. So that is why it's labeled pet casket. I also should have the plans coming out somewhat soon. Learning SketchUp is not as much of a learning curve as I assumed it was going to be. So I should have those up hopefully within a couple weeks. It's more so finding the time to do it now versus learning the program. But this is, like I said in the original intro and throughout the original video, really geared towards DIYers. The design was not mine, it was the customer's design, but it really lends itself to people that don't have a ton of experience with woodworking, because there's some nice design elements, but not a ton of overtly difficult techniques or skills put into making something like this. So hopefully with the plans, this I would say would fit a medium-sized dog. Hopefully with the plans you could scale that up and down to fit your own proportions, so people can really get quite a range of sizes and versatility out of those dimensions. So this is just the last part. Obviously I haven't done a lot to this since I last posted, mainly just sanding, which I usually don't film because you can't see the incremental changes that well in the video, in my personal opinion. And then next week will be another pet casket. It will probably be 2 parts. I don't know quite yet because I haven't started editing it, and that one is much more elaborate, much more detailed, more of a traditional style casket. And that, like I said, will be up next week, also with plans, both of them free. But I can't remember if I took the lid off of this last time, but it's pretty basic, pretty simple, but yet a classic style design. So I'm starting with the same type of pine for the top. You could see that this board's severely cupped, but when I cut it into sections, it should flatten out pretty well. This sort of cut is not super dangerous to make on the table saw, but if you have a severely cupped or twisted board, those are the cuts that usually bind and where people have kickback issues. So be careful with what you're choosing to cut. So I measured for the outside frame and then for the inside frame. And then I just added my dimensions onto the edge. So I added about 4 inches onto where this will have to overlap the center panel, because this is going to be a raised panel top. So I'm cutting all of my stiles at 4 inches. Now I thought my stiles and my rails. Now I thought that might be a little wide, and it turns out to be a little wide, but that's okay. I could trim them down and you'll see how I do that. Now I'm making this like a traditional style cabinet door. You can make this out of one piece. It is doable. This is the pieces I have to sand, obviously, everything down, and I could cut my stiles to length right away. But at this point the top is over 12 inches, so finding boards that size can be kind of expensive. So I'm going to be cutting a groove in the center of this, a 1/4 inch groove. So I just marked center, and then I marked an 1/8 inch off of either side, and that's how I'll cut this on the table saw. Now making it like a cabinet style door will also kind of guarantee that it stays flat over time as well. You could see how badly these wide boards do cup over time. So then I could just ride this through and then flip it over and send it through the other side, and I'll get 2 cuts. And that's all I'm doing for these doors. For the rails and the stiles. And then I'm just going to slide the fence a little bit and take off that center nub. Now you could chisel that out if you want, but this one was thick enough that I rode it through the saw again to get rid of it. And then these are all of my panels. You always want to cut these all at the same time to make sure they're as close to exact as possible. So then, like I said, I measured for my outside frame, which is going to be 18.5, and then my groove is 1/2 inch. You can see it marked in there in pencil. It also corresponds with the groove on there. So if I measure from the outer edges of both my grooves, I get about 11.25. So that 11.5. So that is what my rails are going to be, because the tongue of the rail is going to be recessed into the groove of that panel, so you always have to account for that added thickness. You can see with this setting in place, kind of a visualization of what I mean. So in order to cut the tongue on these, I lowered the blade, and then I'm just going to slide it through at a 1/2 inch. You can see my 1/2 inch mark right there. Now this is a test piece. I always do a couple test pieces to get this perfect. Sometimes you have to creep up on the height in order to get it perfect. But I'm just going to make a series of curves. There's a faster way to do this with the Dado stack, but since this is only one door, I just used the regular blade in there, and you could see how that creates my tongue. It was too thick. I test fitted it, and then I raised the blade a little bit, and I'm cutting it again here, and I just do that until it gets just about perfect. You can see how that slides snuggling into place without having to beat it into place, essentially. And then obviously it's a perfect 1/2 inch. So once I had all those measurements dialed in, I could go and cut my 2 rails. You can see I'm just flipping it over, creating that tongue, and then doing the other side as well. I've made enough of these doors over time. The first door I ever made probably took me 2 days, but now I can make a set of doors in an afternoon without a problem. Could just clean up the curves, and then have that frame to this. I'm keep calling it a door because that's usually what I use this construction method for, but it's really just the top of the piece, and I could dry fit everything together and start measuring for my panel. So at this point I knew that this was too wide. The photo is a little hard to see, and I only had one view of it, so it looked wider in the photo than it actually is. So I'll deal with that after glue up. For right now, I'm measuring my diagonals so the door is square, and then I could start doing calculations for the insert that will go in the center. So I'm getting my inside dimensions at this point, and then there they are on the paper, and obviously all these will be in the plans. And then I can lay this out on top here. So basically what I need is I need the same recessed cut on both sides, as well on both ends. So that's kind of what I'm calculating for. Now if you're just doing a regular panel, this is very easy. You don't have to worry about all these measurements. But since I need the raised portion of this panel to sit perfectly inside the frame, that's why there's more math. So all I did was I found center on the frame of the door, center on my raised panel, and then I can mark my 2 edges. So I lined up centers, and then I marked where that hit my stiles. And then the same thing over here, I found center of the entire length of my stile, center of the panel. I lined up those 2 centers, and then on my edge I can mark where the wood is, and that is where I'm going to have to cut so it fits perfectly on that panel. You can see my lines are drawn. Now this is the board I have, so you can see the edges are skinnier than the length, and that is because I didn't want to buy any new pieces. Now this raised panel has a slight angle, so I'm going to account for that angle. And like the groove I cut, it's a 1/4 inch groove. So the little tongue I'm going to leave on the bottom is going to be a 1/4 inch, and I'm cutting that at 10 degrees. So you can see how the X will be the removed portion with the 10 degree. I could set the height of my table saw blade to go perfectly through that piece, and then I could set it away from the fence as well. Now you can see this still has the cup in it because this is another board, and I just make sure to ride along the flat surface. You can see I'm pushing down on one edge so that I get an equal height there, and then I could do the ends the exact same way using the miter gauge. I'm rocking the panel at this point. Like I said, these cuts are doable with cups on boards. You just really have to pay attention to what you're doing. So then there is the outer frame with the angle already cut. You see it lines up with my marks perfectly. So on the bottom, it doesn't go past that original frame I have, but on the top, obviously it does, but that won't matter because it'll be raised up above the piece. So then I just have to go through and remove that piece. So this is leaving a 1/4 inch on the bottom, using my tall fence to make it a safer cut, and then I could just cut a straight cut along the bottom. The top I have to raise a little bit more because, like I said, they were different sizes because of the board I used. And the plans, I might make those the same sizes to make life a little bit easier. I haven't decided yet. And then there's the cut. You could see because of the cup, the ends will be a 1/4 inch, but in the center it gets much skinnier. That will not make a huge difference in this circumstance. It's a very, very slight angle on this panel. And then I could dry fit this into place. So this went into place pretty nicely. I put the top on as well. And that's essentially what it looks like. And then I could glue this together after I dry fit it. I just put glue on the tongues. I usually don't glue any of my panels, even if they're plywood. I especially don't want to glue this because this is solid wood. If you glue it and that center panel, which is quite large, starts to change with seasonal humidity, especially this time of year when the seasons are changing. By the time the customer gets this, it's already warming up here. So when I made this when it was still cold, that center panel's smaller than it's going to be in the summertime. And if you glue everything, it could crack. You want to make sure that center panel can move freely in your frame. So I only ever glue the tongues to the grooves. I can check for square, knock it in one direction or the other if it's out of square, and then check again until it's just about perfect. And then that is what that looks like glued up. Like I said, I knew this was going to be too wide, so what I think I decided to do is take about a 1/2 inch off all the sides just so it looks symmetrical again at the end of the day. Yeah, that looks to, it was a 1/2 inch or 5/8, I can't remember. And then I just have the table saw set up to cut that piece off. This was pretty easy. Like I said, I knew before I started that was probably going to be too wide, but it's much easier to have something too wide than too small. And then the radial arm saw will take care of the rest of the trimming for this. And then that is what the top looks like. So at this point, this is almost done. I just have to put an inner frame in there so it sits on the top perfectly every time. So this is the top I cut off of the original box. I'm going to use the wood on the inside frame, but I'm going to trim it down a little bit because the thicker this wood is, the more it will be subjected to seasonal humidity, like I mentioned earlier. So I had to take it apart, and I always get questions, and I question myself sometimes, the strength of glue, especially on miter joints, which are end grain. And you could see with the mallet, I could not get this apart. So I had to actually saw that one corner joint. And then after that, once you have the joint separated, it's easy to pop apart. But just trying to hammer it apart, I couldn't with my hammer. So that is always nice to see. And then I'm just trimming these down. I don't want them to be 3/4 of an inch. So that's all I'm doing, is taking a side off. Now obviously, if you don't want to do all this trimming and whatnot, you can buy lumber for this project that's already close to or much closer to exact dimensions. So then I could test. I cut these down obviously so they fit right inside the frame. I want a snug fit without being too tight, otherwise you won't be able to take the lid on and off easily. And then with my 2 long runners in place, I can measure for the side pieces, and I can cut those as well. So you can see this just fits in there, but I could still kind of move it around. So then I'm going to glue this together, all the ends, and I'm going to put tape in the corner. That blue tape will not only hold the joint together, but it's going to add just enough thickness on the corners so that when this blue tape comes off and this is all glued together, it'll be slightly smaller than what I need, and that will make it so it slides in and off. And then I'm just going to pop it in the frame for it to glue so that it glues up to the exact inside dimension. This box, I believe, was just about square, but just for the sake of making sure it was perfect, just let it glue inside. You can see I'm using a shim because it is loose enough that it will sag. So I had a little shim in place just to hold it in place while the glue dried. Once that glue dried, one of these was bowed, so you could see I have clamps holding it together square. I measured the offset on all sides until it was perfect, and I apologize, this one-handed camera work in my shop's never great, but it was 1 1/8 on all sides. So I got it all square, so this was perfectly in the center, and then I marked it there so that I have a mark, and I'll put glue on that mark and then attach this. I'm only attaching this with glue. Once again, this has no hardware, brads, or anything in it because it will be cremated at the end of the day. You can't have any hardware in there, so you can see I could just glue that line and attach it. I weighted it once it was on top, and then that's more than enough to hold this in place. And then that's the finished lid. So after this, I did do some sanding on everything, but like I said, that doesn't really show up great on camera. But there essentially is the lid, then obviously some pictures of the whole box ready to be shipped.